interest. I am Malika Ramsey. On this week's program, we revisit the education sector. And we're focusing on what David Granger and a Partnership for National Unity are calling First Day Disarray. Of course, you know, most of our schools, especially the primary schools, have been in the news because of the state of the school compounds and the school buildings of themselves not being ready for students for the September 2013 school term. And of course, with me is leader of the People's National Congress Reform and leader of the opposition, Mr. David Granger. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you very much, Malika.
All right, great. Is First Day Disarray really an appropriate term to address and to describe what's happening in our school system almost every September?
Well, it is most appropriate because that's what's been happening for several years. It's not something new or something sudden. Although people have, the Ministry of Education has over 8 weeks to prepare for the opening of school, which is, I think, the first Monday in September. Every year we seem to have the old set of problems which remain unsolved. So what's been happening around the country, from Port Kaituma in the north, right down to the south, to St. Ignatius, right across the country to East Berbice Quarantine, we've had a situation of unpreparedness, and children, sometimes children going to primary school, they might have just come out of nursery school, there's a lot of confusion. The parents more than ever have been coming out in numbers to make sure that these children are properly accommodated. And what we've seen is a range of problems which tend to be recurrent. So I would say First Day Disarray seems to be a ritual which our children have to undergo every September, and it's time to put an end to it.
Now, before we talk about the time that is there for actual school preparation, is it fair to say, of course this is not necessarily my opinion, but is it fair to say that apparently parents and even some teachers wait until September to raise these issues, because we only see these issues coming up in September?
Well, I don't know how the schools are administered during the break between June and September, but the issues come up because that is when people come up to school and they expect the schools to be ready. The schools are not managed by the students. The schools are not even managed by the teachers. The schools are managed by the Ministry of Education and the education departments in the various regions. And what has been happening is that somebody's sitting on their hands, and they definitely are not using that 8-week period to prepare the schools, because when we look at the problems that the schools have been facing, they're about flooding in the yard, about leaking roofs, they're about bat dung falling on children, toilets not functioning. These are not things that the teachers could fix. There are other issues that the ministry has to be concerned about from a central point of view. For example, the number of teachers. I think in the Madia primary school, we have a situation in which one teacher has about 71 students in the class. Well, it's impossible for her to exercise supervision over that large number. But those issues have to be settled by the ministry. Supply of toilet paper, supply of materials for educational purposes, you know, drawing and other materials. These things come from a central, from the ministry, so they have to be provided centrally. So I would say that there are different levels of involvement, but I cannot see that any blame could be attached to the parents or to the teachers, and much as the students.
Even before I come to the education ministry, you did mention a moment ago that in one classroom there's one teacher as against 71 students. Is this a sign that probably our population is growing? Can we use that?
I don't think that at all. I think probably the Ministry of Education is not paying attention to planning, because they have guidelines, and if they feel that one teacher can supervise 25, maybe we could understand 30 or 32 or thereabouts, but 71, I think it's outrageous. And it does not mean the population growing. It means that the ministry is not planning properly, because the number of teachers who should be allocated to the school population. In primary school, I reckon that, my figures may not be up to date, but I reckon there are over 100,000 children in primary schools. The figure might be a little bigger now, it might be closer to 110, but it will be much more and certainly not much less. And it means that over a long period of time, the Ministry of Education must know how many teachers have to be allocated to teach 100,000 students. And once the number of teachers falls because of dismissals or retirements or resignations, it means that they must take measures to augment those teachers, that number of teachers, through maybe the engagement of persons who had retired, or through the recruitment of more teachers into the Sierra Leone College of Education.
Right. Before I speak about some of the problems some of the schools are facing specifically, the Ministry of Education. Now, for example, when we have the release of the results of the National Grade 6 Assessment annually, we hear big celebration and big noise coming from the Education Ministry. Why do you believe, however, that the Education Ministry is silent on these matters facing and affecting our primary schools?
Well, it is quite bizarre that in the middle of this month, September, which is called Education Month, that is on the 13th, I think that might have been a Friday the 13th. That's a bad lucky day. But there was a big rally in Georgetown. The president attended, the Minister of Education attended. I think there was a big parade and they were celebrating Education Month. So it is quite bizarre that they're celebrating Education Month in the midst of turmoil, because parents were picketing, from Port Kaitrum right down to Mahdia and across the country. Parents were protesting, and here we are celebrating. What is there to celebrate? We want to see good schools, we want to see clean toilets, we want to see well-staffed classrooms, we want to see buildings which are habitable, not infested with mosquitoes and bats. And that is what we're looking at, that's what we should celebrate. But the contrary seems to be prevailing, that the primary school system particularly seems to be run down. And although I don't want to generalize, it has been happening too long, and it's been happening in too many places.
For the benefit of our viewers, I must say this even before I ask the next question. Mr. Granger is not a person who promotes or encourages personal attacks, but I must ask you, Mr. Granger, is it that Ms. Priya Manik-Chan, the current Minister of Education, is it that she doesn't know how to handle these problems facing the education sector, especially for primary school students?
I wouldn't put it like that, because it's a huge ministry and it's got a large multi-billion-dollar budget. Something must be wrong. A minister is responsible for giving policy direction, but the situation here is that, of course, the minister is very influential. The situation here is that there has just not been adequate preparation for the new academic year. I wouldn't personalize it, but she's got a staff, she's got a chief education officer, and he is the one who's been around, putting fires out in La Parfatamani and Parika Salem and all about the country. So there's a huge bureaucracy there. There are lots of chiefs and deputy chiefs and assistant chiefs. But, the war is not being won on the ground, because many of the problems could be solved. And very frequently, when the protest is held by the Parent Teachers Association, within 2 or 3 days, the problem could be resolved. For example, at La Parfatamani, I think there was a complaint that the burnt-out section of the school was not, could not be used, and the headmistress had to be using the passageway or the corridor. And after the protest, we told that money would be provided and the repairs would be done. Well, why can't they be done in June or July? So the minister has to accept ministerial responsibility, because she has to come to the National Assembly to explain. But certainly the bureaucracy in the Ministry of Education must prepare the schools better, so that our children don't have to go through this ordeal every year, the first day disarray every September.
You mentioned the National Assembly. Are you planning to, or I should say, is your team planning to take these matters to the National Assembly?
Definitely.
Okay.
This is a national catastrophe, that so many schools affecting so many students could be dysfunctional on day one. This is not something the National Assembly could ignore, and I'm sure that our Shadow Minister for Education will be raising it at least as a question. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, we indicated that we'll be bringing a motion to investigate the entire education system, calling for a commission of inquiry into the education system, because we don't want to go around, just cherry picking at problems and trying to apply band-aids here and there. We want a functional education system, and something is wrong as a whole. We are not tackling the problems in a holistic manner. We mustn't feel that the problem only exists at Parika or at Betavwacting or at Golden Grove. There obviously is a problem that is pervasive in the education system.
If I could talk a bit about the St. Agnes Primary School now, that is not exactly a new school, and it's been around for decades. So what I'm thinking is that the problems that would have affected those students should have been seen long before now. In your mind, why is it that we're having those kind of, especially problems with seating, availability problems at the school?
I agree, the problem should have been resolved before, and I can't answer the question. You'll have to ask the minister the answer to that question, but these are problems which are quite predictable. You know the school population is growing, you know the space isn't growing, well then you either have to put the students in other schools or provide more space. And that's the logical approach to it, but I'm not seeing that type of thinking coming out of the Ministry of Education.
A few months ago, you described what was happening, especially after the results of the National Grade 6 assessment. You called it education apartheid, whereby we saw the separate private schools as against public schools. Do you believe that these systems would promote that situation that you described?
I have discerned, I have not made a careful study, and I wouldn't jump to conclusion, but I've discerned that many of the problems that we mention as causing this what they call first-day disarray occur in the hinterland and rural areas. It's just true that St. Agnes is in Georgetown, but many of the problems did occur in the rural areas. So from the point of view of apartheid, it seems that the rural and hinterland schools suffer most and suffer longest from this infrastructural breakdown. Again, I cannot say because we have to judge on the reports that have been available to us from the newspapers. And it is possible the newspapers may not have covered the whole country because the newspapers have covered a lot in Georgetown and St. Agnes, as you mentioned. They've covered La Parfatamandi, they've covered Parika. But we know there are problems in East Berbice quarantine region. There were shortages of furniture and there were shortages of staff. It could be that no reporter visited or there was no report emanating from that region. So I don't want to make a judgment on limited information because the reports have not covered the entire country. I know there were problems at Kokwani, but at the start of the month we had a problem with the road and vehicles couldn't get through the road, so there's a shortage of food at the school at Kokwani. So there is no way of finding out what happened countrywide until and unless there is some proper commission of inquiry. And that is why we called for a commission of inquiry earlier in September, so that we can find out exactly what's happening on the ground. We don't want to go putting out fires, we don't want to go applying band-aids to little cuts and bruises. We want to know what's happening in the entire system. And I do believe that once we know that, we'll be able to make recommendations to improve the whole primary public school system.
At one point, the office of the head of the presidential secretariat had blamed what they call opposition interference and opposition-controlled NDCs for the problems, especially on the East Coast, that we were having with primary schools not being ready for the September term. Your thoughts, sir?
No, I think those accusations are absurd. We didn't, the APNU as a party and the PNCR as a party, or none of the partners in APNU had anything to do with the disarray that occurred on Monday the 2nd of September. I know that some NDCs were blamed, but in fact, when you look at the other areas, at Mahdia and Port Kaichuma, who's to blame? And when you look back historically, who's to blame about what has been happening over the years at St. Ignatius, where there's no NDC controlled by the APNU. So it is absurd for the minister or the head of the presidential secretary to make any accusations against our party. And when you look at the protests, we have not engineered any protests. The mothers, the PTAs have come out. Sometimes the students and the teachers themselves are picketed. And when you go on the ground, you see why they picketed. The toilets are filthy. The yards are overgrown. The roofs are leaking. There's bad dung falling on the children while they're trying to study. You know, the places are hot. I've been into these schools. And when it's, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it is so hot that it's unbearable. And the PPPC administration must fix these problems. APNU is not to blame, and you get quite a bit fed up of the accusations. 2 weeks ago, there was a crime, a lot of killing in the country, in the West Emerald, and the Attorney General blames the APNU. Now there are problems at school, somebody else blames the APNU. So it's quite untrue, and it's quite unfair to make these criticisms. And the people of the country must know that it's the PPP Civic Administration which is responsible for the collapse on the 2nd of September, this first day disarray, not the APNU.
Do you believe this kind of blame game, especially with the education system? You did say that APNU is in no way to blame, but do you believe these things would eventually penetrate, especially the vulnerable sections of society?
No, I think people know better. If I'm a parent at La Parfaite Harmony, I know who's to blame. APNU didn't burn the school, APNU didn't put caiman after the school or infest the place with mosquitoes. So I think the parents know very well, people know at Madia what's going on. And it is fully the responsibility of the People's Progressive Party Civic Administration, and they have to get it right.
You've always spoken about the schools in the far-off areas, especially in the hinterland regions. And in this case, I'm talking about Port Kaituma now. I read that one of the issues they're having is that they depend on rainwater, and when there's none of that, they're basically left exposed. I'm asking you, doesn't this kind of situation make them vulnerable to diseases and, of course, creating a domino effect, putting a strain on the health system in that community?
Well, we had called for a commission of inquiry, and I must say this again, because even if you go to Breeding Hope, you don't have to go to Port Kaituma, you will see problems. I've been to school, I've seen 8 black tanks, all empty, bone dry. Because there's no pump, or the water isn't being pumped into the tanks and into the toilets. And even at Breeding Hoop, which is a secondary school, we've had situations in which young women have had to take buckets of water to, from the canals. This is the 21st century, and the people have got to go to school with buckets to dip water to flush the toilets. So you don't have to go all the way to Port Kaituma. You can see, even if you go over to Breeding Hoop, you can go to Suzdijk, you can go to any place within reach of the city of Georgetown, within a short distance from the city of Georgetown, and see problems. And it is quite shocking that many problems affect the sanitary facilities. And we seem to be at war with our toilets, and these are facilities which have to be used by staff and students, the whole day, because people are there for 6 to 8 hours a day. And you need them, and you need them to be working properly.
It's unfortunate that I have to ask this next question, and just so I put it in context for the viewers. So thus far, we're talking about problems, and these are what have been reported and what we know about. Problems at BV, the primary school there, Port Kaituma, Georgetown, and of course there's more than one school in Georgetown, Essequibo Islands, West Demerara, La Parfaite Harmony, and of course most recently in Madia. I said that now to ask you, Mr. Granger, is there anyone or are there persons in Guyana who are qualified, and I'm talking probably managers and engineers here, qualified to address these problems that we face? Because why are we having so many problems simultaneously across the country?
My view is that the problems are largely administrative and political in nature. I think we have the technical expertise, there's no doubt about that. But the way contracts have been awarded and the way that they've been supervised, the completion has been supervised, might be at fault here. And what we need is a Ministry of Education which is aware of the scale and the scope of the problem. That is why we call for this commission of inquiry. It seems that the bureaucrats are surprised every September. The parents are not surprised. Because I remember, it must have been last year, I went to one school and I was shown this empty classroom and said, look, I went on a Sunday and I was told that the next day, Monday, would have been the first day of, the first Monday in September when schools are normally open. And I was shown this empty classroom, and lo and behold, students turned up. And of course, they had nowhere to sit. There was a big, there was picketing, there was some, and within 3 days, they got the furniture. So we have the skills, we have the money. The Ministry of Education receives a large chunk of the national budget. So it is not my view that there is a financial problem at present. It is my view that there is a managerial problem, an administrative and a managerial problem. And the political directorate has to take responsibility for that, for making sure that the managers put in place measures to produce quality furniture, or if the furniture is broken, to have it repaired and replaced. So it's not, the blame cannot be put on anyone other than the government itself and the people that they employ to do that, to supervise the education system.
Is there anything that a partnership for national unity or the People's National Congress reform can do outside of Parliament to probably help address these issues?
Well, we will certainly encourage our supporters in all of the regions to be vigilant, to keep an eye on the education system, to prevent abuses. For example, one of the complaints has been vandalism, and we need to pay attention to ensuring that schools are secured and that bandits or criminals don't have access to the schools during the silent hours. Maybe the community could accept responsibility to assist in the security by providing the neighborhood police or the community policing to watch these premises, so that people don't break in and steal the taps and other things which can be broken off and removed. So that sort of thing APNU can do by encouraging residents in the communities to be more vigilant, because their children are the ones who will suffer. Their children are going to be the ones who will suffer if they don't secure those premises.
Apart from the Ministry of Education helping, I know there continues to be a call for the local government bills to be assented to. If there is local government elections soon, do you believe that that would provide more control for persons in various communities to dictate what happens with these schools?
There is going to be empowerment of the citizens, and as we've seen from the protests so far, the ordinary citizens, particularly parents, are the most concerned because their children are affected, and they've always been very vocal in demanding change. Yes, we believe that the local government system as it stands is partly responsible for the failure to provide the types of services at the primary school level, because the NDCs do have a role, and if the NDCs are empowered, and if they have the finance to do so, and one of the local government bills concerns fiscal transfers, we expect that there's going to be more efficient supervision of the work of the schools.
All right. Staying in the education sector, but coming off the infrastructural issues for a bit. Now, I know this is the second year that the People's National Congress reform is contributing to the education sector by awarding students who would have done well. Would you like to just give us an idea of how successful that has been and how much more you plan to do for the sector?
Well, it is a part of our policy in the PNCR as APNU. It's part of our policy to ensure that our children get only the best in education. And in a way, although we're happy to provide the bursaries to our children through the BEST, the Burnham Education Scholarship Trust, it's a pity that we had to do it, because it means that there's some fault in the education system that has to be rectified. And we are committed, we have charted in a small way, but we need to do a lot more at the primary level. The BESD and the PNCR have helped out at the secondary level, because this is the stage at which children enter the secondary schools. But many of the problems we've been discussing here at the first day Disarray are at primary school level. And we need to not only look at the infrastructure, and many of the protests that occurred during September are about infrastructure, school buildings, and the fences and the roofs and the flooding and that type of thing. But we also have to look beyond the infrastructure at the actual curriculum. We have to look at see what has been happening in terms of the quality of education, the teachers, and to make sure that the graduates who come out of our primary school system at that the national grade 6 assessment level, that 11 plus level, are in fact fully prepared to enter into secondary schools. So one of my big concerns right now is that First Day Disarray represents a bad start for children in the primary schools. But it has a knock-on effect on what is going to happen at the secondary school, because if every year they go through this ordeal without being adequately, without having adequate furniture, good schools and enough teachers and so on, it is a recipe for failure. I think this is exactly what's been happening. People do not relate the chaos on first day to the dropout rate and the failures at the national grade 6. Mm-hmm. We do. And we feel that if we ironed out some of the infrastructural problems, we would have a better learning environment so that we don't have to use devices like scholarships and bursaries to help children along. We feel that there are a lot of poor people in this country, and most poor people have to send their children to the public primary schools. And we would like to help them, but at the same time, we feel that the Ministry of Education could do more to give our children a sound education.
Finally, sir, I think when we talk about finances, business, and even crime, we are always concerned about how Guyana looks to the wider world, whether it be Caribbean or North America. This situation, this First Day Disarray that we're having, how do you think, what kind of image is created for Guyana as it relates to what the rest of the world thinks about us?
Well, it's an image of disorder. It's an image of disorganization. There's nothing good to say about that, and it can't be hidden, because every day, almost every day throughout the month of September, there have been photographs, there have been articles about the protests. So the government has really shot itself in the foot here if they're trying to boast about the achievements in education, and this is Education Month. Well, then they've got it all wrong, and they need to put right the system of public primary school education and send a message not only to people overseas. Maybe we don't always care what the people overseas think, but I do care what the people in Guyana think. And I want the Guyanese parents to have greater confidence in the public education system, and right now I can't tell that to people at Madia or Port Kaituma or Golden Grove, the Backless, because they know what's happening on the ground. Over at La Parfaite Harmony, over at Parika, they know better than I do, and that is why they locked the gates and prevented their own children from going, because the place is dangerous. So I think the newspapers have given us a clear picture of the chaos on the ground.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. This has been another edition of The Public Interest. Of course, I was with Leader of the People's National Congress Reform and Leader of the Opposition, Mr. David Granger, and we were discussing First Day Disarray. Of course, that as it relates to the primary school education system. Until next time, I am Malaika Ramsey. Thanks for watching.